So like I mentioned, that meeting is scheduled to take place again this morning. Murimi Mwangi has been keeping an eye on this particular story for us. Murimi, this meeting specifically did not take place yesterday because of the electoral law changes. The NASA team making it very clear they're uncomfortable with the changes. And at some point, they asked for time to go and consult some of their leaders. What are you hearing on the ground in terms of today's meeting, and if at all they've gone through some of these changes and what their thoughts are?
Good morning, Linda. Well, the meeting yesterday was adjourned before key issues in the agenda could be discussed because NASA raised concern that there was a bill pending in Parliament, the Election Laws Amendment Bill, that seeks to make some changes to the Kenyan electoral laws with regard to transmission of results manually and electronically, and which in a way seems to depart from what NASA has said is the precedent set by the Supreme Court on the importance of the electronic aspects of the results transmission system, as well as other processes within the election, including voter identification. And of course, just yesterday, after the NASA team raised concern that there was that bill pending in Parliament, which neither of the parties had been able to go through, the chair of that meeting, the chairperson of IEBC, Wafula Chebukati, suggested that they meet today morning shortly after 10, so that each of the parties will have taken some time to read that particular bill, which NASA said will have implications on how the meeting resolves key issues that have been listed in the agenda. Remember, the representation from NASA yesterday was senior counsel, the Siaya Senator James Orengo, accompanied by the CEO for the NASA coalition, Norman Magaya, as well as senior counsel Paul Mwangi. Many will remember that team from the Supreme Court petition that nullified President Uhuru Kenyatta's re-election. On the Jubilee side, you had Raphael Tuju, the Secretary General of the Jubilee Party, accompanied by Senate Majority Leader Kipchumba Murkomen, as well as Davis Chirchir, who served as the chief agent for President Uhuru Kenyatta in the recently nullified elections. And therefore, it will be interesting to see how simultaneously, as parliamentarians digest the contents of that bill, how these two teams will be trying to understand the implications of that particular bill on the matter that is subject to deliberations here. Remember, the NASA outfit has particularly raised concern about two companies, that being Al Ghurair, that printed the ballot papers, the results declaration forms, and other electoral material for the nullified August 8th polls, as well as the French-based company Safran Mofo that supplied the electronic infrastructure for the Kenya Integrated Elections Management System that was used for voter identification, as well as transmission of the results that were disputed at the Supreme Court. And therefore, it will be interesting to see the decision ultimately from that sitting on these two companies, as well as the implications of what is happening in Parliament today to the session that will be ongoing at the Bomas of Kenya. Linda.
Murimi, clearly the irreducible minimums that were put across by NASA will be part of the conversation they'll be having. But then listening into some of the legislators from the NASA side, they're saying the timing for these electoral changes is off. It's like being in a football match and then someone changes the rules halfway. Talk to me about the issue of timing and why it should concern, or it does concern, NASA legislators.
Well, it's interesting. Depending on whom you speak to, whether from Jubilee or from NASA, they give different opinions regarding the introduction of that bill in Parliament. For the Jubilee side, they keep insisting that it has been informed by the Supreme Court verdict, while the NASA team says that that bill is meant to water down the precedent that was set by the Supreme Court. If you've been able to see snippets of that particular bill that will be discussed this morning, you realize that there's inclusion of a clause to make the declaration of the presidential results to be based largely on the manual results transmitted from the polling station to the constituency tallying center and ultimately to the national tallying center. Remember, there's already a precedent from the Court of Appeal that the results declared at the constituency are final, and therefore they want to make it mandatory that the presiding officers from the polling stations have to dispatch the hard copies to the constituency, and the declaration thereafter to be based largely on these particular results that have come from the presiding officers in the polling stations to the constituency. Again, there's also a provision that seeks to bar the Supreme Court from declaring such results declaration forms as void on the basis of lacking key specifications of the features of that form. You remember this was a discussion at the Supreme Court because some of the results declaration forms did not have the security features that had been agreed upon between IEBC and the Dubai-based firm Al Ghurair, and therefore the Jubilee team is seeking to seal that particular loophole because the invalidation of President Uhuru Kenyatta's re-election was largely based on these inconsistencies, including some declaration forms that had the security features, others that did not have these. Again, there's also a provision for criminal culpability on any presiding officer that deliberately or by commission or omission refuses to sign the results declaration forms from the polling stations, or for returning officers at the constituency. Remember, this was a discussion again at the Supreme Court about some of these forms that did not have the signatures, and therefore the NASA team says that the discussion ongoing in Parliament, should it culminate in the enactment of that bill into law, would water down the precedent set by the Supreme Court. Because if you remember, the verdict of the Supreme Court was that should technology fail, then the IEBC should have a complementary mechanism to verify the results. But again, the discussion happening in Parliament has another very interesting context to it, because on Monday, there was a verdict from the Court of Appeal to a case that had been filed shortly after discussions into the Election Laws Amendment Act in December last year by the now defunct Coalition for Reforms and Democracy. And in that verdict, the judges seemed to allude that the alternative to technology is manual. And remember, this has been a discussion that has put Jubilee and NASA at loggerheads for quite some time, because some of the proponents of the technological aspect of the elections, led by senior counsel James Orengo, have insisted consistently that the law envisions an integrated elections management system that is electronic in nature, and therefore the backup system also ought to be electronic in nature, but the Jubilee side is seeking to introduce the manual aspect as a fallback plan should technology fail. Linda.
Okay, Murimi, finally, before I let you go, so like I mentioned, when this bill was being discussed in Parliament yesterday, opposition legislators walked out, I think in protest. But then the team that is meeting today at the Bomas of Kenya, someone looking at, we have, 27 days to go to the repeat poll. They do not necessarily have the luxury of time. There are issues they absolutely must discuss before the close of the day and probably come to an agreement. Talk to me about the importance of today's meeting. This is not the first time this meeting is being called. A couple of others had been called. They did not take place. They failed to materialize. But this one looks like it will take place looking at the precedent that was set yesterday from both teams. The importance of today's meeting, 27 days to the election.
Well, you might say that the fact that the NASA team and the Jubilee team were able to sit in the same room to discuss these contentious issues is a win. It's a first win for IEBC, because remember the NASA outfit has previously said they will not come to any such deliberative session with the IEBC unless their demands of the reducible minimum have been handled. And therefore, yesterday's meeting, you could say, was a plus, much as the only thing that they discussed was the agenda of the meeting, which agenda did not, whose discussion did not proceed because there was a bill pending in Parliament. And therefore, for there to be consensus between the parties, you could say that as each of the two sides has to cede some ground, and there has to be that perception of goodwill to the discussion that is ongoing. Perhaps largely the reason why the James Orengo team declined to proceed with the discussions unless they had perused the bill that will be before Parliament. And these are interesting times for the IEBC, because the two simultaneous events happening, the meeting at Senate, Bomas, as well as the discussion in Parliament will set a new precedent for the repeat presidential poll that is less than 30 days away, and therefore there has to be goodwill from all the parties, the IEBC, as well as the political players. Linda.
All right, Murimi Mwangi, keeping an eye on that meeting that is taking place this morning, I believe from 10 a.m. At the Bomas of Kenya. Remember, that meeting was pushed to today after the NASA team asked for time to sort of consult their leaders on the Election Laws Amendment Bill. So that meeting is taking place this morning between IEBC and representatives from Jubilee and NASA. And we are waiting to see the outcome of that particular meeting. Remember, NASA has been very categorical on the irreducible minimums, and Murimi alluded to some of them. They're a little bit uncomfortable about Al Ghurair being the company that prints the ballot papers. They're uncomfortable about Saffron Morpho. They're uncomfortable about the IEBC CEO Ezra Chiloba and 10 other officials who they say need to leave office. So let's take a look at